Dawn over Hampshire, England. Limestone towers rising 300 feet above misty moorlands. 197 rooms in silence. An empire built on secrets buried beneath Victorian gardens. A library with 5,650 ancient books that no one has completely catalogued. Egyptian basements sealed for 80 years. Fortunes lost in a single night of poker. Heirs who died before they could claim the title. The Carnarvon family believed the noble title was a blessing, but each generation would discover it was a sentence of inevitable financial ruin. Aristocratic legacy or generational curse. This is the story of Highclere Castle. Not the version the world knows through Downton Abbey. Not the television fantasy of impeccable butlers and 5 o'clock tea served in china porcelain. This is the real story. The one the Carnarvons kept hidden for a century. The story of how one of England's most privileged families fought for 5 generations against an enemy they couldn't defeat, the very castle that defined their identity. Highclere is not just stone and mortar. It's an organism that consumes, that demands, that devours fortunes with the patience of something that knows it will outlive anyone who tries to tame it. Since 1679, the land where it sits has been home to the Herbert family. But it was in 1842 when the mansion transformed into what we know today. And that transformation marked the beginning of a financial spiral from which no Earl of Carnarvon would escape unscathed. This castle has witnessed archaeological glory that captured the entire world's imagination. It has guarded Egyptian treasures that caused global sensation. It has been the setting for one of the most successful television series in history. But behind each moment of splendor, there exists an account book that tells another story. One of growing debts, desperate sales, and heirs who seriously contemplated abandoning everything. The Victorians believed that architecture was an expression of moral character. That a noble building produced noble inhabitants. That stone could elevate the human spirit. Highclere was designed under that philosophy. 5,000 acres of pastoral perfection. Halls with 40-foot ceilings. Towers that declared permanence before a changing world. But permanence has a cost. And that cost is collected generation after generation. Between 1922 and 2010, 5 Earls of Carnarvon inherited not just a title, but an impossible equation: how to keep standing a symbol of a dead world using resources from a world that no longer valued such symbols. Each one tried to solve it differently. Each one failed. Until fiction did what reality could not. This is a story about ambition and consequence. About how an archaeological discovery that should have secured a family fortune ended up initiating its collapse. About heirs trapped between loyalty to a glorious past and the brutal need to survive the present. It's a story about England itself. About what happens when a complete social system collapses and the families that sustained it must adapt or perish. About castles that become museums of themselves. About aristocrats who become administrators of their own history. And it's a story about secrets. Because in Highclere's basements, still partially sealed, still not completely catalogued after a century, rest artifacts that the family has never fully explained. Objects that returned from Egypt wrapped in warnings. Documents that disappear from archives. Deaths that occur in statistically improbable sequences. The press called all this the Pharaoh's curse. But curses are simple. They have clear villains and innocent victims. The truth is more complex, more painful, and much more interesting. Because if there's a curse at Highclere Castle, it didn't come from a 3,000-year-old Egyptian tomb. It came from something much more mundane and much more devastating. The simple arithmetic of keeping standing something the modern world no longer needs. Welcome to Highclere Castle. Not the television one. The real one. The one almost no one could save. In 1679, when Robert Sawyer, attorney to the Crown, purchased the land at Highclere, it was simply that: land. Good land. Fertile. Well-positioned. But not exceptional. Charles II England had hundreds of similar properties. Modest manor houses surrounded by enough acres to maintain a family in perpetual aristocratic comfort. Or so it was believed. The property eventually passed to the Herbert family through marriage in 1692. For 150 years, the Herberts were exactly the type of nobility that England produced in abundance. Titled, respectable, wealthy enough not to work, prudent enough not to be ruined. Generation after generation managed the land, bred horses, attended the House of Lords when absolutely necessary, and generally lived lives of discreet irrelevance. Until Henry Herbert, the third Earl of Carnarvon. Henry was different. Born in 1800, he grew up during the Regency, that strange era where England celebrated victory over Napoleon while simultaneously wondering what it meant to be British in a post-Napoleonic world. It was an era of national self-evaluation. And Henry Herbert applied that self-evaluation on a personal level. He looked at the Georgian manor house where he had grown up and decided it wasn't enough. Not for an earl. Not for a family that had served the crown for generations. Not for someone who believed that architecture was the physical manifestation of moral purpose. In 1839, Henry hired Charles Barry. This name must be paused because its significance is extraordinary. Charles Barry was, at that precise moment, designing the new Palace of Westminster. The building that would house the British Parliament after the fire of 1834 destroyed the original. Barry was literally drawing the physical image of British democracy. And Henry Herbert asked him to apply that same vision to a private house in Hampshire. The project began in 1842. Original plans estimated 5 years of work. £20,000 sterling. A considerable sum but manageable for an earl with annual rents of approximately £8,000 coming from agricultural lands and urban properties in London. The original plans were naive. Construction consumed 17 years. £45,000 sterling. In current terms, approximately £5.8 million. For context, with that money in 1842, Henry Herbert could have bought 30 elegant houses in Belgravia. He could have financed 3 complete expeditions to Antarctica. He could have established a trust that generated £2,000 annually perpetually. Instead, he built Highclere. Barry designed in Jacobean style, that peculiarly English hybrid of Gothic influence with Renaissance pragmatism. Towers that rose 300 feet, not for defensive necessity but for pure visual declaration. Windows that not only let in light but framed the landscape like living paintings. Halls designed not for comfort but to impress. The stone came from Bath quarries. 2,000 tons of limestone extracted, carved, transported 60 miles by cart. Each block numbered according to its position in Barry's design. Specialized Italian stonemasons were imported because locals didn't have experience with the ornamental techniques Barry demanded. The wood came from oaks from Highclere's own grounds, some 400 years old. They were felled, cured for 2 years, and transformed into staircases, panels, coffered ceilings. Carpenters worked for months on a single door, hand-carving patterns that replicated medieval illuminated manuscripts. The ceilings of the main halls were covered with imported gold leaf. Not gold paint. Real gold, beaten into sheets so thin that 1,000 stacked sheets measured less than an inch. Artisans applied 15,000 individual sheets using techniques developed in the Italian Renaissance. The library was designed to house 5,650 volumes. It's not an arbitrary number. Barry calculated the exact space needed for Henry's collection, plus 20% for future growth. The shelves were carved in mahogany imported from Honduras. The mobile ladder system was manufactured in wrought iron using designs Barry had experimented with in parliamentary libraries. 300 rooms in the original configuration. Not because a family needed 300 rooms, but because Victorian social hierarchy required differentiated spaces for every imaginable function. Rooms for the family. Rooms for high-ranking guests. Rooms for middle-ranking guests. Rooms for guests' companions. Rooms for senior staff. Rooms for middle staff. Rooms for junior staff. Kitchens. Pantries. Laundries. Ironing rooms. Boot rooms. Army. Gun rooms. Smoking rooms. Billiard rooms. Private chapel. Each space meticulously hierarchized. Each detail communicating position. The Victorians understood that architecture was language. Highclere spoke the language of established power like few private buildings in England. But the language of power is expensive to learn. And more expensive to maintain. While construction progressed, Henry Herbert faced what every heir after him would face. The castle had a will of its own. Each design decision generated 3 more. Each finished room revealed that the adjacent one now looked inadequate. The main staircase demanded a more grandiose entrance. The entrance demanded more elaborate landscaped gardens. The gardens demanded more elegant stables. The stables demanded appropriate accommodation for grooms and trainers. The project grew like an organism. And like an organism, it needed constant feeding. The accounting records of the era, preserved in Highclere's archives, show a disturbing pattern. In 1842, the construction budget represented 2.5 times Henry's annual rents. Significant but manageable with financing. In 1845, it had grown to 4 times annual rents. In 1850, to 5.6 times. By 1859, when construction finally finished, Henry Herbert had invested the equivalent of almost 7 complete years of his total income. But here's the detail that official histories rarely mention: the rents didn't remain static during those 17 years. In fact, they decreased. British agriculture faced massive transformation between 1840 to 1860. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 opened the British market to cheaper imported grains. Landowners who depended on agricultural rents saw incomes reduced between 15 to 30% in a decade. Henry Herbert was no exception. Simultaneously, he was investing capital that could have protected him from that reduction in ornamental stone and gold leaf. When Highclere was completed in 1859, Henry was 59 years old. He had achieved his vision. The castle stood magnificent over Hampshire. Visitors came from London specifically to admire it. Architecture magazines presented it as the supreme example of the Jacobean revival. Barry himself considered it one of his masterpieces, comparable to Parliament in ambition if not in scale. Henry Herbert had built a monument. To his family. To his title. To his values. To England itself. He had also built a financial trap that would consume 5 generations. Because Highclere didn't just cost £45,000 to build. It cost £3,000 annually to maintain. And that number would only grow. Every roof would need replacement every 40 years. Every window would require regular restoration. The heating systems, installed with 1850 technology, would become obsolete. The plumbing would require constant updates. The staff to clean, maintain, operate 300 rooms would eventually reach 60 permanent employees, each requiring salary, accommodation, food. And this without considering the gardens. 5,000 acres required 40 gardeners working full-time. Stables for 50 horses needed 15 grooms. The deer park needed gamekeepers. The hunting grounds needed guards. The private roads needed maintenance. Henry Herbert had created not just a building but an economic ecosystem that demanded perpetual feeding. He died in 1890, at 90 years old. On his deathbed, according to testimony from his private secretary recorded in family archives, he said something extraordinary. "What we build defines us. But it also enslaves us." His son, Henry Howard Molyneux Herbert, 4th Earl of Carnarvon, inherited Highclere with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The pride was obvious. Few families possessed something comparable. The apprehension was mathematical. Annual rents had fallen to £6,000. Maintenance costs now reached £3,500 annually. The margin was narrowing. The 4th Earl attempted rationalization. He reduced staff. He closed complete wings during winter to save on heating. He sold minor properties in London. He operated Highclere like a modern corporate administrator would operate a struggling company. Strategic cuts, forced efficiency. It worked. Temporarily. For 25 years, he maintained precarious balance. Highclere didn't grow, but it didn't collapse either. Then, in 1890, he died unexpectedly of pneumonia at 64. His son, George Herbert, inherited the title at just 24 years old. George Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, is where this story truly begins. Because George didn't want to administer. He wanted to transcend. And his search for transcendence almost destroyed everything 3 generations had built. George Herbert was everything his father wasn't. Where the 4th Earl was prudent, George was reckless. Where his father saw limitations, George saw possibilities. Where previous generations had accepted the traditional role of landed aristocrat, George sought something more. Something that would define him beyond the accident of birth. In 1901, that something almost killed him. George was an early automobile enthusiast. He drove one of the first Daimler cars to arrive in England. On a German road, during what the British press called reckless driving at excessive speeds, he lost control. The vehicle overturned. George suffered massive injuries. Doctors didn't expect him to survive. He survived. But his lungs were permanently damaged. The humid, cold air of England became intolerable. British winters caused recurrent pneumonia. Doctors recommended dry climate. They recommended Egypt. This medical recommendation changed Highclere Castle's destiny. Egypt in 1901 was the favorite destination of British aristocrats in recovery. The climate was perfect. The luxury of Cairo hotels rivaled the best in Europe. And there was something more: history. History not in books but in sand. History you could literally unearth. Egyptology was in its golden age. Since Champollion deciphered the hieroglyphics in 1822, Egypt had transformed from exotic curiosity to scientific and cultural obsession. European museums competed to acquire artifacts. Explorers published discoveries in magazines that sold like popular novels. The British public devoured every news of discovered tombs, exhumed mummies, revealed treasures. George Herbert arrived in Egypt in 1902 to recover his health. But he found something more, a purpose that transcended managing ancestral lands. In 1907, he met Howard Carter. Carter was an archaeologist, illustrator, and what could generously be called a difficult personality. Brilliant, obsessive, socially inept, and absolutely convinced that the Valley of the Kings still guarded greater secrets. He had worked for other patrons, but his temperament caused constant conflicts. He needed financing. He needed someone with patience, resources, and willingness to finance years of potentially fruitless work. George Herbert needed something that would give meaning to a life that the automobile accident had irrevocably altered. It was a perfect marriage. And it was the beginning of Highclere's financial ruin. Between 1907 and 1922, George Herbert financed 16 separate archaeological expeditions. Not small week-long excavations. Massive operations that lasted months. That employed hundreds of local workers. That required equipment, transport, accommodation, permits, bribes to Ottoman officials, and the infinite patience that archaeology demands. Financial records preserved at Highclere document the costs with painful precision. First expedition, 1907, £2,000. Second expedition, 1908, £3,500. Third expedition, 1909, £4,200. By the 10th expedition in 1916, in the middle of World War I, George Herbert was spending £18,000 annually on Egyptian archaeology. This while Highclere operated with maintenance costs that now reached £4,500 annually due to wartime inflation. The numbers didn't work. They simply didn't work. Rents from agricultural properties, the traditional sustenance of families like the Herberts, had been devastated by the war. Labor was scarce. Product prices were controlled by the government. Imports of cheap grains from America continued. By 1918, George's annual rents had fallen to £4,800. He was spending almost 4 times his annual income on archaeological expeditions. How did he sustain it? By selling urban property in London, stocks, bonds, pieces of family art that weren't strictly tied to the estate. Each year, something was liquidated to finance another year of searching in Egyptian sand. His family protested. His wife, Almina Victoria Maria Alexandra, heiress to a Rothschild fortune, initially supported the adventure. But even her patience was wearing thin as she watched capital evaporate in the desert. Estate lawyers drafted increasingly alarming memos. The family council scheduled uncomfortable meetings where middle-aged men tried to explain simple mathematics to the 5th Earl. George ignored them all. Because George Herbert wasn't simply rich playing with expensive hobby. He was a true believer. He had read every text on Egyptology. He had studied maps of the Valley of the Kings until he memorized them. He consulted with experts from the British Museum. He had developed his own theories about where undiscovered tombs must be. And Howard Carter, despite his impossible temperament, was genuinely brilliant. His expeditions weren't random operations. They were methodical, scientific. Carter had systematically eliminated areas of the valley during 15 years. His logic was impeccable. If all known tombs followed certain patterns, the unknown ones must be in areas that didn't follow those patterns. The problem was that the Valley of the Kings is large, and sand is patient. By 1921, they had spent £250,000 accumulated. In current money, approximately £15 million. They had found things, minor tombs, interesting artifacts, enough materials to fill several rooms in British museums. But nothing that justified the investment. Nothing that captured public imagination. Nothing that was worth what it was costing Highclere. Lawyers presented George with a document in June 1922. It was simple. If he continued at the current rate, Highclere would have to be sold within 8 years. The mathematics allowed no other conclusion. The estate was being consumed from within. George signed authorization for a final expedition. One last season. 1922 to 1923, if they found nothing significant, it would end. He promised it. On paper. With witnesses. Howard Carter returned to Egypt in October 1922 with that knowledge. It was his last chance. He chose an area he had avoided for years because it was partially covered by remains of ancient workers' huts. Clearing the area would require weeks of tedious work removing debris that would probably reveal nothing. On November 4, 1922, an Egyptian worker found a step carved in stone. By November 26, they had descended 16 steps and found a sealed door. Carter sent the telegram that would change everything. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations. George Herbert boarded the next available ship to Egypt. On November 26, 1922, he and Carter drilled a small hole in the inner door of the tomb. Carter inserted a candle and looked inside. According to his own account, George asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter replied, "Yes, wonderful things." They had found Tutankhamun's tomb. Intact. Unlooted. Containing treasures that surpassed anything previously discovered. The news exploded globally. Newspapers in London, New York, Paris, Berlin published front-page stories. George Herbert instantly became one of the most famous people in the world. The archaeological discovery of the century. The vindication of 16 years of searching. The justification of £250,000 invested. George Herbert was 56 years old. He had finally achieved what he sought, to be known for something more than an inherited title. He had 4 months to live. On April 5, 1923, George Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, died at the Continental Hotel in Cairo. Official cause, septicemia caused by infection from a mosquito bite aggravated by pneumonia. His fragile health since the automobile accident finally gave way. But the press had another explanation, the Pharaoh's curse. Sensationalist newspapers, particularly in London and New York, published extraordinary stories. That Cairo's lights had gone out at the exact moment of his death. That his dog at Highclere had howled and died simultaneously. That an inscription in the tomb warned of death for whoever disturbed the pharaoh's rest. None of these stories were verifiable. The inscription never existed. Blackouts were common in Cairo. The dog, no one really knows what happened to the dog. But the narrative was established. And the narrative sold newspapers. What the narrative didn't mention was much more interesting than any supernatural curse. George Herbert died before he could capitalize on his discovery. Rights over the artifacts were complex. Egypt claimed national ownership. The British government claimed excavators' rights. Museums offered massive sums, but legal processes blocked sales. George had invested £250,000 searching for treasure that would be worth millions. He died before seeing a penny of return. And the legal process to determine who owned what would consume years and cost tens of thousands more in legal fees. His son, Henry George Herbert, inherited the title of 6th Earl of Carnarvon in 1923, at 26 years old. He also inherited Highclere Castle with £500,000 in hidden debts that his father had never fully revealed. The real curse had just begun. There are moments in history where everything converges. Where decisions made over generations, unpredictable circumstances, and pure chance meet at a singular point that redefines everything that comes after. For Highclere Castle, that moment was November 4, 1922. But to understand why that day changed everything, we need to understand what was happening beyond the Egyptian sand. We need to understand what was happening in England. Because while George Herbert sought glory in ancient tombs, the world that had sustained places like Highclere was silently collapsing. World War I ended in 1918. Britain won. But victory had a cost that few aristocratic families fully anticipated. 750,000 British died in the war. Another 1.6 million were wounded. But military numbers only tell part of the story. The war destroyed the social system that had sustained the landed aristocracy for centuries. Before 1914, being Earl of Carnarvon meant something specific. It meant natural authority over local communities. It meant automatic seats in institutions of power. It meant your opinion mattered simply because of who you were, not what you knew. It meant young men from your county enlisted because you, personally, asked them to. Tens of thousands of those young men didn't return. And those who returned different. They had seen incompetent aristocratic officers send battalions to certain death. They had seen social hierarchies collapse in trenches where birth mattered less than competence. They had developed deep skepticism toward the system that had sent them to die. The British social contract was broken. And that contract was the invisible foundation on which places like Highclere stood. But there was more. The war cost money. Money on a scale no nation had spent before. The British government financed that spending with massive debt, printing money, and something that hit families like the Herberts particularly hard, taxes. In 1914, the maximum income tax rate in Britain was 8%. In 1918, it was 30%. And that was just the beginning. Labour politicians, strengthened by the post-war labour movement, pushed for massive wealth redistribution. They argued, not without reason, that aristocratic families had enjoyed privileges for centuries while common British people made the real sacrifices. It was time to balance the scales. In 1919, Parliament passed new inheritance tax laws. Previously, inheriting a title and entailed estate generated modest taxes. The new laws imposed rates of 40 to 50% on the total estate value at the titleholder's death. This was a financial time bomb under every British aristocratic family. Because these estates weren't cash. They were lands, buildings, art collections, libraries. Illiquid assets. When an Earl died, his heir suddenly had to pay the government 40 to 50% of the assessed value of everything immediately. No installment option. No consideration that selling everything to pay taxes would destroy the estate itself. This policy deliberately forced liquidation. It was wealth redistribution disguised as tax policy. And here's where the moment of November 4, 1922 becomes critical. George Herbert had spent £250,000 of liquid capital during 16 years. Capital that, otherwise, would have been invested in income-generating assets. Bonds. Industrial stocks. Commercial properties in growing cities. The type of investments that prudent families made to protect themselves against uncertain times. Instead, that capital had evaporated in sand. When he found Tutankhamun's tomb on November 4, 1922, it seemed like perfect vindication. He had risked everything and won. The treasures were worth millions. The discovery would secure the family fortune for generations. Except it wouldn't. Because antiquities laws were changing simultaneously. Egypt, technically independent since 1922 though still under British influence, was developing strong cultural nationalism. Egyptian intellectuals argued that treasures discovered on Egyptian soil belonged to Egypt, regardless of who found them. The Egyptian government claimed ownership of all Tutankhamun artifacts under new national heritage laws. George Herbert and Howard Carter argued that the terms of their excavation permit granted them rights. Complex legal negotiations began. These negotiations would take years. They would require expensive lawyers. And the outcome was uncertain. Meanwhile, George Herbert was getting sick. Medical records, preserved in family archives and reviewed by historians decades later, show George Herbert was dying weeks before he finally succumbed. The infection from the mosquito bite was the catalyst, but his compromised respiratory system meant any infection would be potentially fatal. Documents suggest he knew he was dying. And he was terrified. Not of death itself, but of what his death would mean for his family. Because if he died before the legal situation resolved, before Tutankhamun's treasures could be sold or profitably exhibited, his son would inherit a title and a devastated estate. He would inherit Highclere valued at £800,000 for inheritance tax purposes, which meant an immediate tax bill of £400,000. £400,000 that the estate didn't have in liquid form. In his last days in Cairo, George Herbert desperately tried to secure agreements. He sent telegrams to museums in London and New York. He offered exclusive exhibition rights. He tried to sell his life story to publishers. He sought any way to convert the discovery into real money before dying. He didn't succeed. On April 5, 1923, at 1:55 a.m., George Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, exhaled his last breath at the Continental Hotel. Cairo's lights didn't magically go out. There were no supernatural signs. There was a 56-year-old man dying of infection in a foreign hotel, alone, aware he had just financially destroyed his family while trying to secure their future. The irony is brutal. 3 days later, his body began the journey back to England. He was buried at Beacon Hill, overlooking Highclere Castle. The funeral attracted crowds. Newspapers covered the event as the end of an age of exploration. George Herbert was celebrated as a British hero who had expanded human knowledge of ancient civilizations. No one mentioned the account books. No one mentioned that as his coffin descended, lawyers were already calculating the financial disaster his death activated. Henry George Herbert, now 6th Earl of Carnarvon, received official notification of his inheritance tax bill 6 weeks after the funeral. £421,000. Payable in 6 months. Total liquid estate available, £73,000. Lawyers presented options. All terrible. Option 1. Sell Highclere completely. Seek buyer for the entire property. This would cover taxes and leave something for the family. But it meant the end of 250 years of Herbert history on that land. Option 2. Sell contents. Liquidate art collections, libraries, antiquities, furniture. Everything except the structure itself. This might cover taxes but would leave an empty shell. Option 3. Negotiate with the government. Request installment payments. Demonstrate that immediate liquidation would destroy historic patrimony. This option was humiliating and without guarantees. Option 4. Sell secondary properties, beg wealthy relatives, mortgage everything mortgageable, and pray. The 6th Earl chose a combination of options 2, 3, and 4. Sales began in 1924. Christie's auction, June 1924, Medieval Manuscript Collection. £18,000. Christie's auction, November 1924, Flemish paintings from the 16th and 17th centuries. £34,000. Private sale, January 1925, urban property in Mayfair, London. £52,000. Private sale, March 1925, shares in shipping company. £28,000. Each sale was painful. Each liquidated object had been in the family for generations. But there was no option. What official documents don't capture is the emotional cost. Testimonies from Highclere staff from that era, compiled by historians, paint a heartbreaking picture. The young 6th Earl walking through increasingly empty rooms. Marks on walls where paintings had hung for 100 years. Empty spaces in libraries where irreplaceable volumes had been. His wife, Catherine Wendell, from a wealthy American family, watched the stripping with growing horror. She had agreed to marry a British earl imagining life of pastoral elegance. Instead, she was witnessing financial demolition in slow motion. By 1927, the 6th Earl had paid the inheritance taxes. Highclere was still in family possession. But the estate had been decimated. Income-generating investments had been sold. What remained was the castle itself, the surrounding agricultural lands, and debts accumulated from hurried sales. And the world kept changing. The 1920s witnessed continued agricultural depression. Land rents kept falling. Industrialization meant rural labor migrated to cities. Rural property values stagnated while urban properties rose. Highclere was trapped. Too large to sell easily. Too expensive to maintain with declining agricultural rents. Too historically significant to demolish. The discovery of Tutankhamun had made the fifth Earl world famous. It had secured his legacy in history books. It had been the achievement that transcended aristocratic birth. It had also initiated his family's financial destruction. In 1928, 5 years after George Herbert's death, Howard Carter finally completed cataloguing Tutankhamun's tomb. The process took 10 years. The treasures filled 5 rooms at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The Egyptian government granted the Herbert family exactly 0 of those artifacts as compensation. What they did allow was for some duplicate or lesser historical significance pieces to return to England. These arrived at Highclere in 1929. 3.6 tons of material catalogued as minor objects, embalming tools, papyrus fragments, ceramic containers, funerary cloths. They weren't the treasures that would have changed the family fortune. But they were all that remained of £250,000 invested during 16 years. The 6th Earl placed them in Highclere's basements. In sealed rooms. With limited access. Some stories suggest they were cursed. That staff refused to work in those rooms. That objects moved on their own. That strange illnesses affected those who handled them. More boring but more likely stories suggest the 6th Earl simply didn't want to deal with them. They represented his father's failure. The obsession that had consumed the family fortune. He sealed them because looking at them was too painful. They would remain sealed for 80 years. And during those 80 years, each subsequent Earl would face the same impossible question: how does something designed for an era that no longer exists survive? If Highclere's story were fiction, this would be the moment where the hero finds an ingenious solution. Where decades of artistic accumulation convert to fortune that saves the day. Where the archaeological discovery finally pays dividends. But this is real history. And in real history, downward spirals rarely stop cleanly. The 6th Earl of Carnarvon operated Highclere during the most difficult decades for British landed aristocracy. Between 1923 and 1969, he witnessed transformations that made his grandfather's world unrecognizable. The Great Depression hit in 1929. Agricultural prices collapsed globally. Land rents, already low, fell another 40%. Families that had depended on agriculture for centuries discovered their lands generated losses, not profits. Tenants couldn't pay. Properties lay abandoned. The 6th Earl attempted modernization. He introduced agricultural machinery. He consolidated small farms into more efficient operations. He fired traditional workers and hired managers with education in modern agronomy. It worked. Marginally. Losses were reduced. But Highclere still wasn't self-sustaining. The castle consumed more than the lands generated. Always. And then came 1939. World War II transformed England more profoundly than the first. This time, the conflict reached British territory. London bombings. Severe rationing. Total mobilization of the economy. The British government requisitioned large properties as hospitals, training centers, troop accommodation. Highclere was converted into a hospital for war wounded. The 6th Earl and his family were relocated to a small section of the property. The rest was handed over to the Ministry of War. The compensation was insulting, £2,000 annually. Basic maintenance costs of the castle were £5,000. The government paid less than half while using the complete building. But refusal was impossible. It was wartime. Patriotism demanded sacrifice. And frankly, the 6th Earl had no options. War taxes on rents had risen to 75%. Operationally, he was bankrupt. The war lasted 6 years. During those 6 years, Highclere suffered damage no government compensation would cover. Rooms converted into medical wards were modified for functionality, not preservation. Walls were torn down. Ceilings were reinforced with industrial steel beams. Electrical systems were overstressed. Plumbing hastily installed during the Victorian era collapsed under constant use by hundreds of people. The gardens, previously maintained by 40 gardeners, were converted into vegetable plots for food production. Ornaments were removed. Statues were stored, some lost. Landscaped paths were destroyed by heavy military vehicles. In 1945, when the war ended and the government returned Highclere to the family, the sixth Earl walked through his ancestral property and wept. According to testimony from his butler, recorded in memoirs published decades later, the Earl said, "This isn't a castle. It's a ruin with a roof." 40% of rooms had significant damage. Roofs had leaks in 60 documented locations. The electrical system was dangerous. Heating didn't work in 3 complete wings. The gardens were plowed fields. The stables were structurally unsafe. Estimated restoration cost, £380,000. Available resources, almost none. Worse still, the post-war Labour government, led by Clement Attlee, intensified redistributive policies. Inheritance tax rates rose to 75% of estate value. Income taxes reached 90% for the highest brackets. These weren't just tax policies. They were deliberate social engineering. The explicit goal was to eliminate the landed aristocratic class as an economic force in Britain. And it was working. Between 1945 and 1955, approximately 400 major country houses were demolished in England. Not from bombings. From economics. Families simply couldn't maintain them. Post-war repair costs, combined with confiscatory taxes, made demolition the only financially rational option. Highclere came close. Very close. In 1947, the sixth Earl convened a family meeting. Attendees included his wife Catherine, his 2 sons, representatives of extended branches of the Herbert family, and 3 lawyers specializing in estate law. The meeting's purpose, formally decide whether to donate Highclere to the National Trust and renounce the title. The National Trust was an organization that preserved historic properties by converting them into public museums. They would accept Highclere, manage its maintenance, and allow the family to live in a small section as paid guardians. It was the fate of dozens of aristocratic houses. Lawyers presented numbers. Without emotion. Coldly. Option 1, keep Highclere, requires immediate injection of £380,000 for critical repairs. Requires £8,000 annually for basic maintenance. Current land rents, £3,200 annually. Guaranteed perpetual deficit, minimum £4,800 annually. Mathematical conclusion, complete bankruptcy in 6 to 8 years without massive external capital injection. Option 2, donate to National Trust. Family retains title but loses control. Lives in 8 rooms. Receives stipend of £800 annually. Castle becomes museum. Tourists walk through family rooms. Privacy eliminated. Questionable dignity. But no financial stress. No bankruptcy. Highclere preserved for the nation. The decision seemed obvious. Catherine Wendell, the Countess, said no. She was American. She had grown up in New York during the American Gilded Age. Her family had built fortune in 1 generation through business, not inheritance. She didn't understand British resignation to the inevitability of aristocratic decline. She believed that with modern management, Highclere could be self-sustaining. Not as symbol of feudal dominance, but as a business. She invested £150,000 of her own family fortune. Money that was technically hers, not of the Herbert estate. Money her family had earned through railroads and real estate during the 19th century. That money saved Highclere. Temporarily. The most critical repairs were completed between 1948 to 1952. Not complete restoration. Just enough to make the building habitable and prevent structural collapse. Roofs repaired. Basic electrical system updated. Functional plumbing. Heating in main areas. Catherine also implemented administrative modernization. She fired 40 of the 60 permanent employees. She replaced them with 15 employees who worked efficiently using modern equipment. She mechanized agricultural operations. She leased lands to commercial agricultural companies instead of small traditional farmers. She converted sections of the castle into luxury apartments she leased to wealthy families. She opened the gardens to the public during summers, charging modest admission. She organized private events, weddings, corporate banquets, organized hunts for the wealthy. It was by British aristocratic standards, vulgar. Commercializing family property. Charging for access to ancestral gardens. Renting rooms where generations of Herberts had slept. But it worked. Between 1948 and 1959, for the first time in almost a century, Highclere operated with small profits. Some years only £500 positive. Other years £2,000. But positive. Accounting records from that period, meticulously preserved, show something extraordinary. 11 consecutive years where income exceeded expenses. It was fragile. An economic crisis could destroy the balance. An unexpected major repair could cause deficit again. But it existed. Catherine had achieved what 3 generations of Herberts couldn't: make Highclere pay for itself. It should have been replicable. It should have been sustainable. It wasn't. Because in 1960, the 6th Earl began selling parts of the Egyptian collection at private auctions in New York. Why? Official documents don't explain. Finances were stabilized. There was no immediate crisis. Catherine had demonstrated the model worked. Testimonies from staff of that era suggest something darker. They say the 6th Earl had developed an obsession with the sealed basements. That he spent hours there. That he talked about completing what my father began. That he believed the artifacts were active. These are stories. Impossible to verify. But the sales are documented facts. Between 1960 to 1968, approximately £85,000 in minor Egyptian artifacts were sold discreetly. Not to museums. To private collectors. Through intermediaries. Without publicity. Buyers reported something strange. Each artifact came with a written document. A warning that detailed unfortunate precedents associated with objects from Tutankhamun's tomb that suggested buyers consider appropriate precautions. Some buyers rejected the purchases. Others completed them but never publicly exhibited the objects. One reported that his lawyer advised him not to accept the purchase after reading the warnings. Was it genuine concern from the 6th Earl? Legal protection against possible lawsuits? Or something more? We'll never know. Because in 1969, at 72 years old, the 6th Earl died of a sudden heart attack while working in Highclere's basements. His body was discovered by a gardener 3 hours later. He was surrounded by Egyptian documents. Papyri. Photographs from the original excavation. His father's diaries. And an account book open to a page showing the accumulated costs of the 16 expeditions, £250,000. He had written something in the margin. In his own handwriting. Dated the day of his death. It wasn't worth what it cost. His son, Henry George Reginald Molyneux Herbert, became the 7th Earl of Carnarvon. He was 35 years old. The will reading was brief. Lawyers detailed the estate's condition. Assets: Highclere Castle, 5,000 acres of land, reduced collections of art and antiquities, some remaining Egyptian artifacts. Liabilities: £1.2 million in accumulated debts. The balance Catherine had achieved during 11 years had evaporated during the 1960s. Artifact sales hadn't benefited the estate. The money had gone somewhere. Records were confusing. Possibly mismanaged. Possibly worse. 1969 inheritance taxes, £520,000. Payable in 6 months. The 7th Earl sat in silence for 14 minutes after the lawyers finished. Finally he asked, "How long do we have before we lose everything?" The senior lawyer responded, "That depends on your decisions during the next 5 years. But to be clear, without dramatic intervention, Highclere won't survive until the end of the century." It was 1969. There were 31 years until the year 2000. The lawyer was being optimistic. The 7th Earl of Carnarvon faced an equation no amount of intelligent management could solve. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Annual income from all sources: agriculture, leases, events £22,000. Minimum annual expenses: basic maintenance, taxes, essential staff £31,000. Guaranteed annual deficit: £9,000. Accumulated debt: £1.2 million. Pending inheritance taxes, £520,000. Payable in 6 months. There was no way to win. only ways to lose more slowly. The seventh Earl chose the strategy every previous generation had chosen: sell the past to finance the present. The first sales were predictable. Stocks, bonds, minor properties that still remained in the estate. These liquidations generated £180,000. Not enough for taxes, but enough to negotiate an extension with the government. Then came the painful sales. Sotheby's auction, March 1970, Medieval Armor Collection. 14 complete pieces that had been displayed in the Great Hall for 120 years. Each piece catalogued, authenticated, with documented provenance. Estimated value, £85,000. Sold for £62,000. The antiquities market was saturated. Dozens of aristocratic families were liquidating simultaneously. Supply exceeded demand. Buyers knew sellers were desperate. Each auction generated less than estimates. Christie's auction, September 1971, Flemish master paintings. 3 works from the 17th century. One of them, according to documents, had been purchased by the second Earl directly from a studio in Antwerp in 1701. Estimated value, £120,000. Sold for £89,000. The seventh Earl attended this auction personally. Testimony from an attendee, published in Memoirs in 1998, describes the scene: the Earl sitting in the back, motionless, watching each bid. When the hammer fell with final price £31,000 below estimate, he closed his eyes for 30 complete seconds. Someone asked if he was all right. He responded, "I'm watching 270 years of family history being sold for less than it costs to repair the roof this year." Because that was the cruelest aspect. The money generated barely covered immediate needs. There was nothing left over. Nothing that could be invested to generate future income. Each sale bought time, not solutions. Bonham's auction, April 1973, Georgian silver collection. Trays, candelabras, tableware. 240 pieces accumulated during 3 centuries. Some marked with the Herbert family crest. Some gifted by British monarchs in recognition of services. Estimated value, £45,000. Sold for £31,000. The British press began to notice the pattern. Articles appeared in the Times and Telegraph. The slow liquidation of Highclere. The Carnarvons sell their history piece by piece. Another great house in slow death. The tone was melancholic rather than critical. England was watching the end of an era. The families that had defined British social structure for centuries were disappearing. Not dramatically, but gradually, silently, through auctions in London where no one bid high enough. But the seventh Earl had no time for melancholy. He had immediate operational crises. In 1974, a section of roof in the East Wing partially collapsed during winter storm. Structural evaluation determined that 40% of the original roofing system needed complete replacement. Cost, £185,000. There was no £185,000. Not even close. The seventh Earl made a decision no previous Carnarvon had seriously considered. He permanently closed the entire East Wing. 45 rooms sealed. Furniture covered with sheets. Windows boarded up. Heating disconnected. Electricity turned off. Simply abandoned. This reduced maintenance costs by £6,000 annually. But it also meant admitting defeat. It meant accepting that Highclere would never be completely restored. That the castle would shrink generation by generation until perhaps only the central core remained habitable. Staff from the era report an atmosphere of defeat. The seventh Earl worked personally on basic maintenance. He repaired windows. He cleaned gutters. He mowed lawns. Not by preference but by necessity. There was no budget to hire sufficient help. His wife, Jean Margaret Wallop, from an American aristocratic family, struggled to maintain appearances. But it was difficult to pretend elegance when closing rooms for lack of funds to heat them. Sales continued. 1975. Complete collection of 18th century Chinese porcelain. £28,000. 1977. Flemish tapestries from the library. £64,000. 1979. Antique furniture from the West Wing. £19,000. 1981, collection of illuminated medieval manuscripts. £42,000. 1983, minor objects, 200 years of accumulation. £33,000. Each sale was permanent loss. Each sold object had been part of Highclere for generations. Had been mentioned in family letters. Photographed in portraits. Recorded in inventories dating centuries. And each sale bought, on average, 2 years of basic operation. Accounting documents from the period 1970 to 1985 tell a painful story. Slow, consistent income of approximately £25,000 to £30,000 annually. Expenses that never dropped below £35,000 no matter how much was cut. The gap was filled by selling heritage. It was unsustainable. Obviously unsustainable. But there was no alternative. In 1985, the 7th Earl seriously considered partial demolition. Architectural plans were commissioned. Feasibility studies completed. The proposal: demolish the north and east wings completely. Reduce Highclere to central core of approximately 80 rooms. This would reduce maintenance costs by 60%. Would make the castle potentially manageable with agricultural rents and event income. The plans still exist in Highclere archives. They show a mutilated castle. 2 phantom wings eliminated. Towers reduced. Barry's architectural symmetry destroyed. The 7th Earl scheduled a meeting with English Heritage, organization overseeing historic buildings, to discuss demolition permits. The meeting never happened. Because the day before the appointment, a British bank offered a loan of £350,000 against the land value. Terms: 25 years, high interest, but avoided immediate demolition. The 7th Earl accepted. Highclere gained another reprieve. Temporary. The loan allowed critical repairs deferred for a decade. Electrical systems updated. Basic plumbing repaired. Enough maintenance to prevent catastrophic deterioration. But it added £18,000 annually in interest payments to operational expenses. The gap between income and expenses grew. The 1990s brought new crisis: competitive tourism. Dozens of aristocratic houses had opened to the public as tourist attractions. They competed for limited visitors. Windsor Castle, Blenheim Palace, Chatsworth House, Warwick Castle. Each offered elaborate experiences, guided tours, cafes, gift shops, special events. Highclere attempted to compete. It opened to the public during summer. Tours at £8 per person. They hoped for 20,000 annual visitors. They achieved 8,000. The reasons were simple. Highclere didn't have captivating public history for casual tourists. The Tutankhamun discovery had happened 70 years earlier. The generation that remembered the original excitement was dying. Young people didn't know the connection. And frankly, compared to castles offering medieval reenactments, elegant cafes, and interactive programs for children, Highclere offered rooms with furniture. It was historically significant for architects and heritage enthusiasts. For casual tourists, it was just another English castle. Tourism income averaged £18,000 annually. After tour operational costs, staff, extra maintenance, insurance, net profit, £4,000. It wasn't enough. In 1998, the 7th Earl gave a rare interview to a journalist from Country Life magazine. He typically avoided press. But this journalist had grown up near Highclere and wrote a personal letter requesting an interview, promising respectful treatment. The interview, published in March 1998, was extraordinary for its honesty. Quotes from the 7th Earl. People believe living in a castle is pure privilege. They don't see the bills. They don't see the impossible decisions. Every winter I decide which rooms we can heat. Every spring I calculate how many critical repairs we can postpone another year. I've sold more family heritage than all my ancestors combined. Not by choice. By necessity. And it's still not enough. If my son inherits this, he inherits a burden, not a blessing. Part of me hopes he finds an honorable way to end it. Donate everything to the National Trust. Live normal lives. Let professionals manage the museum Highclere essentially already is. The interview caused modest sensation. Other aristocrats contacted the 7th Earl expressing solidarity. Everyone faced similar challenges. But solidarity doesn't pay bills. In 2001, the 7th Earl died at 77. Natural death. Heart problems. His son, George Reginald Oliver Molyneux Herbert, became the 8th Earl of Carnarvon. He was 45 years old. He had worked in finance in London. He understood numbers. And Highclere's numbers were terrifying. Accumulated debt, £12 million. Lawyers presented the usual options. Sell. Donate. Partially demolish. Declare bankruptcy and let creditors liquidate everything. The 8th Earl chose none of them. He told the lawyers, "Give me 2 years. If I haven't found a solution by then, we'll donate everything." No one believed he would find a solution. 5 generations hadn't found any. But the 8th Earl had an advantage none of his predecessors had. The 21st century was beginning. And the 21st century would bring something that would change everything. Massive budget television entertainment produced for global audiences. Julian Fellowes wasn't looking to save a British aristocratic castle when he began writing Downton Abbey in 2009. Fellowes was an established screenwriter. He had won an Oscar for Gosford Park in 2001. He had written several successful films. He knew how to tell stories about British class systems because he had grown up in that world. His family had aristocratic connections. He understood both the superficial elegance and the real tensions that existed above and below stairs. The idea for Downton Abbey was simple: create a period series about an aristocratic family during a time of massive social change, 1912 to 1925. Show both the family and the staff. Explore how a complete social system adapted or collapsed under pressure from modernity. It was a risky concept. Period series were expensive to produce. Modern audiences supposedly weren't interested in slow dramas about privileged people. ITV executives, British Television Network, were skeptical. But Fellowes was insistent. And he needed the perfect location. He needed a castle that looked exactly how audiences imagined British aristocratic castles were. Not too decadent, like Versailles. Not too austere, like a medieval castle. Something in the perfect middle, elegant but accessible, grand but habitable, obviously wealthy but not alienating. The production team visited 30 properties. Each had problems. Too small. Too modern. Too restored. Too ruined. Difficult location. Uncooperative owners. Then they visited Highclere Castle. It was perfect. The Jacobean towers provided iconic silhouette for opening titles. Interiors had exactly the right mixture of worn opulence. Gardens were extensive enough to seem infinite on screen. The library, the hall, the dining room, the staircases, everything seemed designed specifically for period television. Fellowes wrote later, "I walked through Highclere and saw Downton Abbey fully formed. I didn't have to imagine what it looked like. It already existed." But there was a problem. Highclere wasn't a National Trust museum. It was the private home of a family with £12 million in debts. The 8th Earl had promised 2 years to find a solution or donate everything. He was at month 18 of that deadline. Production offered £10,000 per week for filming rights. For context, this was approximately what Highclere generated in 3 good months of tourism. And production would need to film for 16 weeks for the first season. £160,000. For allowing filming crews to use the castle for 4 months. The 8th Earl accepted immediately. But even he didn't anticipate what would come. Downton Abbey premiered in September 2010 in the United Kingdom. The ratings were acceptable. Not spectacular. 7.7 million viewers for the first episode. Decent for a period drama on ITV. Then it arrived in the United States in January 2011 on PBS. It exploded. American audiences, especially over 40, became obsessed. The show offered exactly what was missing in American television of the era: carefully developed characters, patiently unfolding plots, no gratuitous violence, no constant cynicism. It was elegant. It was escapist. It was addictive. By season 2, Downton Abbey was PBS's most watched program. By season 3, it was a global cultural phenomenon broadcast in 100+ countries. And everyone knew where it was filmed. Highclere Castle became world famous. The effects were immediate. In 2010, before Downton Abbey, Highclere received approximately 8,000 paying tourist visitors annually. In 2011, after one season of Downton, 35,000 visitors. In 2012, 78,000 visitors. In 2013, 125,000 visitors. The 8th Earl and his wife Fiona had to hire a professional event management company. They could no longer operate as a small family operation. They needed trained staff. Online booking systems. Security measures. Expanded parking. Cafes. Gift shops. Admission price rose from £8 to £20. And people paid happily. But tourism income was just the beginning. ITV paid £10,000 weekly for filming. The series lasted 6 seasons, 2010 to 2015. Approximately 80 total filming weeks. £800,000 in location payments. Then came Christmas specials. £50,000 each. 3 specials, £150,000. Then came movies. Downton Abbey, 2019, and Downton Abbey, A New Era, 2022. Each movie paid approximately £200,000 for extended filming rights. £400,000 total. Merchandising. The Downton Abbey brand generated products globally. Cookbooks. Travel guides. Fashion collections. DVD and streaming. The 8th Earl negotiated small percentages of some product categories. Varied but significant income over years, approximately £500,000 accumulated. Private events. Companies and wealthy individuals paid massive sums for private events at the real Downton Abbey. Downton-themed weddings, £25,000 to £50,000 each. Corporate events, £20,000 to £100,000 depending on scale. Lady Carnarvon, Fiona, 8th Earl's wife, wrote a series of books about Highclere's history. Lady Elmina and the Real Downton Abbey. Lady Catherine and the Real Downton Abbey. These sold hundreds of thousands of copies, particularly in the United States. Book royalties, approximately £300,000 accumulated. The numbers were transformational. Between 2010 to 2019, Highclere Castle generated approximately £15 to £20 million in direct and indirect income related to Downton Abbey. After increased operational expenses, more staff, maintenance to handle visitor traffic, taxes, net profit, approximately £8 to £10 million. By 2015, when the television series ended, Highclere had paid off accumulated debts completely. By 2019, when the first movie premiered, Highclere had operational surplus for the first time since 1901. The 8th Earl gave an interview to The Guardian in 2016. Quote, "Downton Abbey saved us. It's as simple as that. Without the series, Highclere would have been donated to the National Trust around 2003 to 2004. We would have been tenants in our own home. Instead, we're financially stable for the first time in 5 generations." But here's what's fascinating. The 8th Earl also acknowledged the irony. Generations of my family tried to preserve Highclere by being what it always was, private aristocratic home. They failed because the world changed and that model no longer worked. What worked was converting Highclere into something different. Film set, tourist attraction, commercial brand. Essentially, what my ancestors would have considered vulgar commercialization. Highclere survived by ceasing to be Highclere in the traditional sense. Now it's Downton Abbey in millions of minds. It's a symbol of something that never existed exactly as presented on television. And that fiction saved the reality. The transformation was complete. Highclere no longer operated as an aristocratic house sustained by land rents. It operated as an entertainment heritage business sustained by media income, tourism, and events. The model Catherine Wendell had tried to implement in the 1950s, efficient commercialization, finally worked. But it required a global cultural phenomenon to reach necessary scale. Was it sustainable without Downton Abbey? That was the question in 2015 when the series ended. It turned out yes. Because by then, Highclere had established a strong enough brand. The real Downton Abbey was a concept that existed independently of whether new episodes were produced. The 2019 movie reinforced interest. The 2022 second movie extended it. But even without new content, tourism stabilized around 60,000 to 70,000 annual visitors paying £25 to £30 admission. £1.5 to £2 million annually just from admissions. Private events added £500,000 to £1 million. Gift shop and cafe added £200,000 to £300,000. Gross annual income, £2.5 to £3.5 million. After all operational expenses, which now included 25 to 30 permanent employees, improved maintenance, taxes, insurance, annual net profit of approximately £400,000 to £700,000. It wasn't massive fortune, but it was sustainable, and it allowed continuous reinvestment in the building. Between 2015 to 2020, Highclere completed restorations that had been impossible for decades. £2 million invested in roofs. £800,000 in modern electrical systems. £500,000 in plumbing and heating. £300,000 in garden restoration. The East Wing, closed in 1974, was partially reopened in 2018. Rooms sealed for 44 years were restored. Not completely to original Victorian glory, but functionally, habitually. By 2020, approximately 75% of Highclere was operationally active, compared to barely 40% in the year 2000. The physical transformation reflected the financial one. Highclere had been saved, but it had been saved by becoming something fundamentally different from what 5 generations of Carnarvons had tried to preserve. It was no longer a private aristocratic home that occasionally allowed visits. It was a tourist attraction that occasionally served as private home. The family lived in approximately 15% of the castle. The rest was commercial space. Was it victory? Or was it elegant capitulation? The Eightfell clearly saw it as victory. Highclere survived. The family maintained title and residence. Debt was eliminated. The building stabilized. But for historical perspective, consider what was lost in the process. 70% of original art collections, sold during 1920 to 199,000, and 60% of original libraries, liquidated to pay taxes. Complete family privacy, impossible with 70,000 annual tourists. Architectural control, modifications for tourist accessibility and commercial codes. Aristocratic life rhythm, replaced by constant business operation. George Herbert, the 5th Earl who financed the Egyptian expeditions, had imagined that his discovery would secure Highclere perpetually while remaining fundamentally unchanged. An aristocratic castle sustained by archaeological glory. Instead, 90 years later, his great-great-grandson saved Highclere by converting it into a television set. The irony is almost perfect. Egypt was supposedly the curse. But Egypt also, indirectly, was salvation. Because without the Tutankhamun connection, Highclere would have been just another English castle. The Egyptian story gave it a narrative that eventually attracted Fellows. Fellows didn't choose Highclere just for architecture. He chose Highclere because it had a story. A story of exploration, ambition, consequences. A story that enriched the fiction he was creating. So perhaps the real conclusion isn't that fiction saved reality. It's that sufficiently fascinating reality eventually attracts fiction that saves it. There's a room in Highclere Castle's basements that has never been completely catalogued. It's small. Approximately 12 feet by 15 feet. Low ceilings. No windows. Constant temperature. Controlled humidity, now, with modern equipment. But for 80 years, it was simply closed. In that room rest the artifacts that returned from Egypt in 1929. The minor pieces that the Egyptian government allowed the Herbert family to keep. 3.6 tons of objects not considered significant for exhibition in Cairo. They're not treasures. Not in monetary sense. The golden funerary mask, the thrones, the spectacular jewels, all those are in museums. This is different. These are tools. Implements. Functional objects of life and death in ancient Egypt. Canopic jars for internal organs. Embalming tools. Papyrus fragments with funerary inscriptions. Mummy wrapping cloths. Small amulets that were placed in wrappings. Wooden models of servants for the afterlife. Ceramic containers that held oils and perfumes. Objects that were in direct contact with Tutankhamun's body. Objects that participated in 3,300-year-old rituals designed to protect a soul on its journey to the afterlife. For decades, stories existed. Highclere staff from the 1930s to 1950s reported that no one would work in those basements after sunset. That sounds were heard. That cleaning instruments left there appeared moved. That a female employee resigned after seeing a figure wrapped in bandages near the Egyptian boxes. These are stories. Staff legends. Impossible to verify. Probably exaggerations that grew with each retelling. But some facts are indisputable. 22 people associated with the Tutankhamun expedition died in unusual circumstances within 7 years of the discovery. Not just George Herbert, but associated archaeologists, minor investors, excavation staff. Some from clearly natural causes. Others, less clear. Lord Westbury, collector who had exhibited tomb artifacts in his home, jumped from 7th floor window, 1930. Official ruling, suicide. No note. No explanation. His son, Richard Bethel, Howard Carter's personal secretary, found dead in his bed at the Bath Club, 1929. Cause, supposedly cardiac arrest. He was 35 years old. No medical history of heart problems. Archibald Douglas Reed, radiologist who had x-rayed Tutankhamun's mummy, sudden death 2 months later, supposedly from mysterious illness that doctors couldn't diagnose. Statistical coincidences? Probably. The Pharaoh's curse sold newspapers, so reporters looked for connections where they didn't necessarily exist. But here's what's strange. The Carnarvons themselves never completely dismissed the possibility. The 6th Earl sealing the basements. His written warnings to buyers of artifacts. His obsessive behavior during the 1960s. His death surrounded by documents about his father's expeditions. The 7th Earl never allowed the artifacts to be publicly exhibited. When museums inquired about loans for special exhibitions, he refused. When historians requested access for research, he denied permission. Why? He never explained publicly. The 8th Earl finally allowed professional cataloguing in 2007. Egyptologists from the British Museum spent 3 weeks documenting everything in the sealed rooms. Their report was cautious. They confirmed the objects were authentic artifacts from Tutankhamun's tomb. They confirmed some had significant historical value and deserved appropriate museum preservation. They recommended certain papyrus fragments be transferred to institutions with specialized conservation facilities. But in the report, buried in a technical appendix, was a fascinating section. Several objects present inscriptions that had not been previously documented in official tomb records. These inscriptions require specialized translation. We have photographed the inscriptions and will consult with experts in New Kingdom funerary texts. That consultation never produced a public report. When a journalist asked about this in 2011, the British Museum spokesman said, the inscriptions were standard protective formulas. Nothing unusual. They don't justify special attention. But if they were standard, why weren't they documented in Carter's original catalogue? Why did they require specialized translation? We'll never know. Because the objects remain at Highclere. Catalogued now. Appropriately preserved. But not exhibited. Not accessible to independent researchers. The 8th Earl, in a 2018 interview, said something interesting. There's a reason my family kept those objects private for so long. Not for monetary value. But for respect. Respect towards something we don't completely understand. My great-great-grandfather opened a tomb that was sealed with the intention of never being opened. The consequences of that, perhaps aren't supernatural. But they're not simply financial either. Each generation of my family has paid a price for that moment of glory in 1922. Not because Tutankhamun cursed us. But because my great-great-grandfather's ambition created an imbalance that took 5 generations to restore. And perhaps that's its own form of curse. Not magical, but mathematical. It's an extraordinarily mature perspective. Because the truth is probably less dramatic than any supernatural curse, but more interesting. George Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, took a massive risk. He invested family fortune in a search almost everyone considered impossible. He succeeded spectacularly. He found what he sought. And that success destroyed him. Not from mystical forces, but from simple causality. Success arrived too late to capitalize financially. He died before he could secure return. Antiquities treaties meant the discovery primarily benefited museums and governments, not discoverers. Inheritance taxes, applied at his death, consumed what remained of the estate. His ambition was his ruin. Not because Egyptian gods punished him, but because he risked everything on a high-probability bet. And when he finally won, the economic and political system had changed so much that winning didn't matter. 5 generations spent their lives trying to solve the problem he created. Selling art, closing wings, rationalizing operations, commercializing property. Nothing worked sustainably. Until fiction intervened. Downton Abbey converted Highclere into something new. No longer aristocratic castle, but iconic television set. Global brand. Tourist destination. Is that victory? Yes. Highclere survived. Is that what George Herbert imagined when he financed 16 expeditions? No. Absolutely not. He imagined archaeological glory securing his family's place in history while preserving their aristocratic way of life. He imagined Highclere remaining exactly as it was, simply with better financing. Instead, Highclere survived by transforming into something he probably would have found vulgar, commercialized tourist attraction. The irony is that his discovery, indirectly, made that transformation possible. The Tutankhamun story gave Highclere a narrative that eventually attracted fellows. Without that story, Highclere would have been simply another nice English castle. Architecturally beautiful but not distinctive. So perhaps the real conclusion is this. There was no supernatural curse. But there were consequences. Consequences of ambition. Consequences of risking everything. Consequences of poorly timed success in a changing economic system. And perhaps the reason the basements remained sealed for so long wasn't fear of Egyptian ghosts. It was that they represented something more painful, the real cost of George Herbert's glory. Each object in those basements represented money that should have been invested in bonds, in stocks, in income-generating properties. Money that would have protected future generations. Instead, that money bought historical fame. And almost destroyed his family in the process. Today, tourists stroll through Highclere imagining eternal aristocratic elegance. They photograph the staircase where fictional characters had dramatic moments. They buy tea mugs with the Downton Abbey logo. No one thinks about the account books. No one imagines 7 consecutive Earls desperately calculating how many months they could operate before collapse. No one visualizes auctions where family history was liquidated piece by piece. The public narrative is of successful preservation of British heritage. The reality is of near collapse saved by pure luck of television timing. And in the basements, the artifacts wait. Catalogued now. Preserved. But still not completely explained. What did those inscriptions say that the British Museum considered interesting enough to photograph but not publish? Why does the 8th Earl still refuse to loan them for public exhibition? What do the Carnarvons know that they prefer to keep private? Probably nothing supernatural. Probably they simply prefer some mysteries remain mysteries. Because mysteries attract interest. And interest attracts tourists. And tourists generate the income that finally saved Highclere. So perhaps the final lesson is this. Sometimes, not completely solving a mystery is better strategy than solving it. Sometimes, the question is more valuable than the answer. And sometimes, what's kept in sealed basements matters less than what people imagine might be there. Highclere Castle stands today, stable and maintained, because a family finally learned what 5 generations couldn't. The past can't sustain you if you insist it remain unchanged. But it can sustain you if you transform it into something the present values. The basements guard secrets. But the real secret, the one that matters, was never in the basements. It was in the account books all along.